Thank you, Mr. Sam Nicholas, for being with us today. Before the camera was rolling, you started telling me a story, and I couldn't believe it. So, Mike Maloney, Maloney, who's here at the
Right.
at the law school right now.
Right.
His father, John,
Right.
was your mentor.
He was.
Could you tell us that story just again?
When I finished undergraduate, I went to work for a bank now known as Trustmark. And he was one of the bank officers I established a good relationship with. And so when I decided to leave the bank, I took a leave for a graduate degree. I talked with him about it, and fast forward a little bit, a couple years later, I went into teaching, and there was a vacancy at Millsap, so I applied for that, and he was nice enough to write me a very strong, supportive letter, which I did not know at the time came from a Millsap's graduate, alum, so it was a good connection, and I'm happy to say I secured the post and taught there for 10 years. Somewhere in those 10 years, I get a call from Mr. Maloney, and he wanted to talk with me, and I said, you're coming downtown? You know, Millsaps was a little further north then than it is now, to downtown, and so I stopped by the bank, and he told me he had a son and who might be interested in pursuing a course of study at Vanderbilt or Ole Miss, and then he said, and I knew why I was there, Notre Dame. And I went to Notre Dame, so I said, well, Mr. Maloney, why don't you just have Mike, that's the son, stop by my office at Millsaps, and we'll have a little visit. You know, we did. And I got to know him pretty well. And meanwhile, he went on to South Bend, and then later to law school, which I had done, you know. And so, and to this day, we're very close friends. I haven't seen him in a while. So that's a little unexpected history, I guess I could give you.
So you were born in Yazoo City, though.
Yeah.
But you ended up in Notre Dame.
Yeah.
And then you were in Millsaps.
Yeah.
How did that story? How did you end up in Notre Dame?
Very simple. I followed my father. I didn't know anything but Notre Dame as a youngster, and my dad was quite an athlete, and he played football under Newt Rockney, famous coach. Graduate 1934, and I won't say I was brainwashed, but when it came time to choose colleges, I was, pardon the expression, hell-bent on entering the military and playing a little service football. I played football in high school, but I hurt my leg my senior year and I couldn't finish, and service football was tantamount to junior college, if not better. And the draft was on, so you had to be in some form of, doing some form of military service, or you were going to get drafted. And no one wanted to be drafted as such. So I was on my way to doing that, and an uncle gave me a strong sales pitch, and that put me at South Bend.
Your dad played.
He did. Yeah.
So when did you start playing football?
Oh, I just played high school ball, and
then when you went to Notre Dame, what did you major in?
Business administration, and concentrating in banking and finance.
And from there, was it a natural progression to law school, or was there between that period? How did that end up happening?
Well, let me back up. I did 2 years at Notre Dame, and Notre Dame was all male at the time. We had 5,500 grads and undergrads, and there was a little affiliated school through the woods called St. Mary's, all girls, 500 girls, 10-to-1 ratio. So suffice it to say, the social life at South Bend, for someone who was used to having a good party and time, was not much. And I had a lot of good friends at local schools, Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Millsaps. So I transferred to Ole Miss and graduated in banking and finance, which is how I made the connection with Mr. Maloney and First National Bank then, today Trustmark. I took a leave of absence from the bank after 2 years in their training program, and did an MBA at Ole Miss, and thought I'd go back to the bank. I interviewed with several, but I enjoyed an assistantship I had when I was in the graduate program. So I went into teaching and stayed there for a number of years.
So you end up teaching at Millsaps for 10 years in finance. How did the law story start for you?
One of my first assignments, teaching preparations, was business law. And I had a little introduction to business law through the bank. And I said, well, if I've got to teach this course like I would like to teach it, I've got to go to law school. So I went to school at night. And that was in '63, and graduated in '66. And it was a struggle, but my wife and I were having babies at the time too. So I handed off a baby to her and she to me, and but anyway, it was an interesting, challenging experience, I'll tell you.
So what would that be like? So what was it like going into Jackson School of Law back in the 60s? Like, I'm trying to imagine walking through those doors or leaving the house.
I probably would not have chosen Jackson School of Law had I been able to go to law school. But like I say, I was married, we were having children. I had this nice position, and I just wanted to fulfill it in every way. And so you might get a kick out of this. I taught my business law classes in the old traditional style of Socratic method, and I had a number of graduates who went on to law school and said, well, we've had your course. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, what we're getting now is the same way, like a repeat, the way you taught. And so it made it very, very interesting and challenging and very fulfilling and rewarding.
What did the campus look like back then?
Almost like today. They certainly landscaped it on another scale, but it's about the same size school. Millsaps about 1,100, and we had about 950 or 1,000. 12 to 15 teacher-student ratio. So I enjoyed the closeness, in watching the graduates. I'm not plugging for Millsaps, but about 2 out of 3 graduates in a professional fields, schools or law schools, medical school. Yeah.
So 1963, you begin Jackson School of Law.
Actually, when I was at the bank, I took a couple of courses, one semester, and that was in the bright old year of September 1959. But I couldn't keep up the work at the bank because of rotating hours and attend just a night school. So, but I resumed it after I did my MBA and began teaching, and that was in '63.
And what was it like at the night school? So if you were in a classroom, what would that environment be
Very
like?
challenging, very challenging. There were large classes. The instructors were members of the Supreme Court, and very reputable practicing attorneys. And I established a real bonded relationship with several of the instructors.
Who do you remember?
I remember principally and mostly Chief Judge William Etheridge from Oxford. And Judge Etheridge was a terrific lawyer, judge, and just someone that you'd want to be your father. You know, I'd go by and visit with him in his chambers, if you will, the Supreme Court. He was paralyzed from the waist down due to polio. And so he was in a wheelchair quite a bit, on and off the court. And he'd eat lunch at his desk. I knew what time he was eating. He'd always invite me to have a cup of soup. That's what he ate, basically. And we'd sit there and talk constitutional cases. That was his principal field. And I learned a lot from him.
Do you remember the first time you met him in class?
Well, I knew of his name and reputation, you know. The old law school, the Supreme Court is on the second floor of the Capitol, before the Justice Building. And the library, state law library, was there. And the judges had their chambers on that second floor. Judge Etheridge had a chauffeur and an able assistant to help him in and out of the car and to wheel him up to his office. And I would see him at times coming and going, so we got to know each other in an informal way. He was a very friendly person, always smiling, you know. And so after I finished his classes, I would still visit with him, you know. And he was a great supporter.
The way you talk about him reminds me a little bit of how you talked about your father, and following in your father's footsteps of that being important.
Mm-hmm.
Who was your dad? Like, how did what was the story of you growing up with your family?
Well, I come from a large family, and uncles and aunts. My dad was one of 5 brothers in a family of children of 8, Lebanese descent. My grandparents came over around 1901, 1902. They had a little money. They bought land in Yazoo City. As you may know, Lebanese are very mercantile oriented, and so we had quite an array of families, and as I say, I had all these uncles. They were just like stepfathers. I mean, I'd get advice here, advice there, you know, and I was the oldest of my dad's family of 8 children. So he was quite an influence on me, and it goes without saying. And but back on Judge Etheridge for a minute, I just can't tell you what a marked impression he made on my life.
Did he have an influence on the direction you took in law afterwards?
Not really, and I used to tell him about that, and he would just smile and shake his head. As you may or may not know, in those days, I hope not today, faculty salaries are not the highest as opposed to a mainline practitioner. And I had the opportunity, through some business relationships, to speak to management groups. And in one course I was teaching, labor economics, I I got to know organized labor. So make a long story short, I wound up arbitrating, mediating disputes, which I do today. And I would tell Judge Etheridge about some of my cases, and he would shake his head, and I said, Judge, we just try to keep the parties out of court, and create a private record rather than a public, and it has its place. And if you're interested in that side of things, I began arbitrating officially in 1968. 40 plus, whatever that is,
So in the summer of 1968, you started arbitrating with organized labor.
That's right.
Could we explore that a little bit?
Sure.
Tell us, how did that start?
Well, I'm one that doesn't like, in teaching, like to rely on the textbook altogether, for sure. So I would invite people I knew from Jackson and elsewhere, and respected in their given fields, to my classes, and they were more than happy to come. Like the president of the Mississippi Manufacturers Association, or the man named Claude Ramsey, former president of the Mississippi AFL-CIO, a labor alliance from all of your frontline unions. And I got a call of, I think it was from Claude himself, saying, you want to arbitrate a matter? I think you can do it. I said, well, Claude, I said, I have given it consideration, but, and they said, well, you need one. So that opened the door, and the rest is a little bit of history, I guess.
Was it easy to step right into it, or did you, was it a different world?
It's today, and certainly then, arbitrators, if they belong to certain professional associations, do not advertise. Do not advertise. The only advertisement that the National Academy of Arbitrators approves of is a business card, So it takes a while for your name to get in front of people and established and spoken about, but it took a couple of years, I guess, but I've been pretty active since.
So coming from a tradition not only of law, but, and strong ties with the community,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you just emphasized again, like the kind of practice that you ended up pursuing, or that called you,
Mm-hmm.
was one that really was community-based again.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to be called by the community.
That's right.
How do you think of, is that different than, how would you compare that with what you see in law outside of arbitration? Is it the same? Is it different?
I can't really, probably, yeah, but for the most part, I would think it is, yeah. But I was so confined to teaching and arbitrating, I had little time for anything else practically. And then around in the early 70s, I left teaching because I had greater demands on my time. And in arbitrating, they don't come to your courtroom, you go to theirs, and so travel becomes a real challenge. And I couldn't be in the classroom and teach at the same time. Although I did teach 2 years at Millsaps adjunct, one course a semester.
So by the early 70s, you're starting to move fully into a practice of arbitration.
All right.
But you've also now got some children, you're traveling all the time.
That's right.
What was that life like in the 70s?
I took all 4 boys on a trip occasionally. And one of my highlights with number 4, and I was on a panel, still am, at Yale. Yale has a couple organized labor units, one of which is the law school faculty. And so I was assigned a case with the administration, management, the dean, and the faculty, and the president of the faculty at the law school. So, to make a long story short, though, we resolved it, but I had to make a trip to New Haven to hash it out, and we did. So I took a number 4 son with me, as I said. He was all of maybe 8 or 9, and I had him sitting outside in the waiting area. And he was reading books, and the president of the law school faculty was a real jovial type fellow, and he says, "Mr. Arbitrator, is that your son outside?" I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "Oh, let's bring him in." So we had maybe 15, 20 people sitting around this long conference table, and I'm at the head, and John, the son, is over on the corner a little bit, and they said, "Oh, bring him on up." All right. Well, that was like 1992 and 93. Today, I'm proud to tell you, he's a certified arbitrator. That son. And he's got a case coming up in Dallas. I was talking with him this morning about it, you know. So that was probably the farthest thing from his mind and mine. But I've told Yale that story. What got him his start? I said, "You did."
What are the names of your other 3 boys?
I'm a junior. I have Sam third, Christopher, and Patrick.
And are Patrick, Christopher, or Sam Jr. At the third? Are any of them also attorneys?
No, I think they saw how I labored at it, and they said we could do something else. But anyway,
How have you seen so Jackson practicing in the 50s, 60s, living in Jackson in the 50s, 60s, compared to today?
well, of course, that was at the height of the civil rights movement, which maybe speaks for itself. And Millsaps was like an oasis in the desert compared to the city of Jackson. And we were very open, very broad. We formally desegregated the institution, formally, in the fall of '65. And we had an informal exchange program with Tougaloo prior to that, though, in certain disciplines. But I knew the court system, well, and I've taken a few cases every now and then, and I don't now, but I did then. So I got to know the Hinds County Circuit Court, Chancery Courts, U.S. District Courts, Southern District, and almost pursued a clerkship that was available in '65, '66. Of course, looking back, I'm glad I didn't, but it was awfully inviting.
Starting in '63 at Millsaps, you're really in the heart of the civil rights movement building, and that was a choice to go to the Oasis.
That's correct.
Is that something we could talk about?
Oh, yeah, sure.
So, share with us. I mean, I don't even know how to begin to ask. I mean, what a moment. How did you decide to make that choice? What was happening at that time that compelled you that was something you wanted to step out and do?
Well, I knew a good bit about Millsaps, and I knew its name and reputation, and the quality of faculty. And when I interviewed for the position, I asked a lot of questions and got a lot of answers. And I knew that any institution in the state, that was my best to suit my feelings and interest levels.
Specifically in relation, so race was something that was on the forefront
Oh,
of
yeah.
folks. So what was it? So what was it that Millsaps projected and that you resonated with?
Well, of course, first the law, and civil rights statutes were coming down, court decisions were being handed. And Millsaps, it's a Christian institution, similar to Mississippi College, sponsored by the United Methodist Church. And so we had a good Christian atmosphere there, and the churches were changing. And I was just fortunate enough to be right there where the action was.
So in Jackson, though, it was different, you were saying. So Millsaps as an oasis.
Everything was segregated. Public accommodations, no real change was made there until the Civil Rights Act of '64, and it took 3 years to get a public accommodations case before the court, Supreme Court. That was '67, I think. I had relationships with minority lawyers. One principally was now former Supreme Court justice, and he and I were doing some research together in much younger years. And as a matter of fact, when the old King Edward Hotel, now the new King Edward, you might say, was about to close, my good friend and I left his office on Ferry Street for lunch one day, and I said, Reuben, why don't we go up here to the King Edward coffee shop? Oh, you think so? I said, yeah. This is former Justice Reuben Anderson of the Mississippi Supreme Court, the first minority member. And when we walked in, there was a white waitress with menus in her hand, and she said, "Welcome, gentlemen. I've been waiting for you." I think we may have been the first, I'm not sure, but we did that, and everything went fine, He was probably more nervous than I, but we did that.
How did you meet Reuben?
Just at bar circles, I guess. I knew of him, and he was active in a couple of civil rights organizations, and he and his partner at the time, another former Supreme Court Justice, Fred Banks, were filing lawsuit after lawsuit against school boards to desegregate from Brown versus Board of Education on down, and was having a tough time getting enforcement, but so I got to know him pretty well through those circles.
So if so many people, if the structure was still, you had a lot of good people, but the system and the structure was away, what was it that opened you up to not falling into that sort of same perspective?
Well, my father, his environment was not Mississippi altogether. He went to school in the Midwest for 4 years. He had a sister in Philadelphia, PA. He worked there for a while, and then in the borough of Manhattan for 2 years or so. He had a roommate from Perth Amboy, New Jersey. And so my father was a little more, as he used to say, maybe broad-minded, as opposed to the average friend of his from Yazoo City. And I guess that to some degree rubbed off on me. And when I was at Notre Dame, my sophomore year, I lived off campus. He lived off 4 years. And it gave me the opportunity to really get to know the Polish community, the Italian community, and So it was a real educational experience. And
When did the tide change, or did it change?
it's still changing.
Right.
I can't say. I think you'd have to go to the 70s to see any real significant change in social programs, economic development programs, court decisions coming down, and but here we are. Of course, we still have our problems, but nothing like then. Nothing like then.
What I imagine if you felt that those were problems in the 60s and you had the courage to, even when you love a community, to start fighting for the whole community.
Yeah.
And then it takes years, just years and years. What was that, the patience, I don't know, but I would imagine the patience, the tragedy, the elation. What does that feel? So for people today who are struggling, right, or going through a different struggle, what is that feeling that you went through that you could share with them?
Well, of course, the opportunity is here today. That was not, to a large degree, 40, 50 years ago. And but if I may symbolically just take advantage of the new Civil Rights Museum. And it's so ironic that Mississippi at one time, Jackson, as the capital of the state, almost the bastion of segregation. Now we'll have one of the, if not the, most formidable, museums highlighting the movement days. We've made a lot of progress in many respects, but as history teaches us, progress is a never-ending road, so we've still got miles to travel.
What was a story, if you have an anecdotal story to share of a moment of triumph where you saw some hope?
I had friends in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and when I would confer with them from time to time, just socially, I could see the tide turning more towards the middle than the far right or the far left, even, and so I was encouraged by that. But I'm still in the South, and I enjoy living here, although I traveled quite a bit and have lived elsewhere, but it's socially, it's still a challenge, and to some degree it will forever be, I suppose. I think when our famous William Faulkner gave his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize, as I understand it from reading him, he wrote the speech on the plane over to Oslo, but he highlighted education, and he says man's future lies with his education. And of course, a product of rural Mississippi, he knew what he was talking about.
Speaking of education, and just like a long march, a never-ending wander through the maze, but hopefully upward. What would you? So one thing that's interesting to me, a lot of times when I talk with older colleagues or elders, a lot of times you hear a lot of joy, and you also hear a lot of, well, things have gotten worse. And in your story, I don't hear things have gotten worse. I hear this very uplifting, positive story about love of Mississippi and feeling that in many ways things have gotten a lot better. and that we're building on the back of struggle and giants, and it's a very positive story.
Well, I think overall things have gotten much better. However, it's unfortunate we've got a breakdown in law and order, and we have more crime today than we did many years ago. But I ask myself from time to time, why is that? Why is that? And I'm reminded of a lawyer's comment on a case that he'd just won in a school case, civil rights case, U.S. District Court. And this minister, black minister, came up to him and said, Mr. Leventhal, that was a great closing statement. Great. And he said, I think we're going to win the case. And to which, paraphrasing, Mel said, Reverend, the battle is not here. The battle is with your church in the pulpit. The message he was trying to signal was, if we just practice supposedly what we preach, we'll have a much more civil society. And I believe that more so today than ever before.
What would that mean for a young man or woman who's entering law school or thinking about law school? What would be, so if one piece of advice to a younger person is practice what you preach, right, or think about that, what would that mean for them?
Engage in social programs, volunteer hours. That way you get to know the lay of the land, if you will, conditions people face, why they face them. That's an education in itself,
I've just realized that as an arbitrator, you're a listener.
Oh, yeah.
As a teacher, you're actually a listener.
Yep.
And now the counsel that you're, and to be involved in the civil rights struggle was to be a listener, and now you're counseling, listening. So, listening's a hard thing, though. I'm still just beginning to learn how to listen. My dad tells me that.
Yeah.
What does it mean to, so if a young person wanted to listen, or if I wanted to listen, what sort of advice might you give us about how do you listen?
Consider all points of view. Don't just listen to one side or the other. Get stipulated facts, or facts that you can pretty well prove up in your own mind, and you've got a basis and a foundation for that. And then draw strong conclusions and stand by them.
As when you say draw strong conclusions and stand by them, an idea of principle.
Right.
And on the other hand, principles in constant evolution. Things are always changing. You have to understand how the principle lives and evolves. So to me, just thinking about that sounds like a struggle. As I look forward, how to exactly to do that, how to do right in a situation. I imagine that's the same with arbitration.
Most of my opinions are written. I give very few from the bench. Occasionally, particularly if the contract calls for it, if the parties have requested it. But you've got to be sure of those facts. And you see, in arbitration, you're almost a judge, jury, and executioner. I had several close friends, attorneys, federal judges, and one who was a little bit of a mentor with me, he's former chief judge, now deceased, for the Fifth Circuit, Judge Charles Clark, who also holds an honorary degree from Mississippi College Law School. He knew I arbitrated, and I knew he was considering doing so upon his retirement. But before he retired, we were on the plane together going to Houston. And he got on a little later than I did. He saw me with my legal pad. I was making a few notes, and he said, "Arbitration, Sam?" I said, "Yes, Judge." And he said, "I'm glad it's you, not me." We don't have federal rules. We establish what we deem to be reasonable and satisfactory. And of course, some statutes do control, and starting with, of course, the agreement the parties have entered into. But it's a very challenging profession, and but just like in the courtroom, the judge has to put on the blinders. Indeed, if there's no jury, and tell it like it is, then that's my challenge.
Wow, what a story. As I was just thinking for a moment while we were basically changing the tape, really, in the new version of that story, is you have these 4 boys and talking about your father and these mentors and colleagues and the waitress, and there's also your wife who raised these 4 boys, who was there with you through law school. What's your wife's name?
I'm not married currently, but and I had 2 wives. 3 sons by a woman named Donna. She's still active, and one named Olivia. She's the mother of John, the youngest. But they're very strong women, and they'd have to be to put up with this guy. I ask myself from time to time, why boys, not girls? But they're very close, all 4. Yeah.
Wow.
And it goes without saying, I'm proud of them.
And I always ask this, and I always know I'm venturing into choppy waters when you ask that question, yet it's such an interesting part of a story.
Mm-hmm.
I just had one last question
Sure.
for you, really.
All right.
I can already tell that there's so much, that it's banal to say so much unexplored.
Uh-huh.
It's very difficult to ask questions of a gentleman who is a listener, and to understand how to listen. I'm becoming more aware of that, even really in our time together. So I'm just thinking, if we gave you if there was just a platform right now to speak to younger people like Van and myself and others who will listen to this tape about what your hope is moving forward in the years to come, and speaking to us, what would that be for yourself and for your family and for Mississippi?
Well, of course, it goes without saying, we all would like to see a much more civil society, and respect for the law, and more energized religious environment. But like the poet said, we've got miles to go before our sleep, and I'm afraid that we've got decades to go, at least, Well, we've made a lot of progress. And I think by far and large the majority would acknowledge that. Of course, we will be put to a test next week with with election week, we'll see whether that holds true again, you know.
What do you personally look forward to with your own future?
I'm a person without any hobbies, virtually speaking. I enjoy athletics, but I'm not a fisherman, I'm not a hunter, I'm not a 6-9 hour per day golfer. I enjoy working, and working with parties, trying to resolve disputes. I'm proud to tell you that I have had a hand in meeting, I helped resolve, settling about 1 out of 3 cases on my docket. That's a challenge. I like to think it is, I know, but the parties tell me it is, and so, but that's what keeps us moving, you know, not get stalled, you know, lengthy strike or lockout or something of that nature. I'm speaking of labor relations now, you know. As you can see, I wasn't born yesterday, but I think I've got a few more good years in hearing cases, and I don't mind traveling still. I can travel. The Lord has blessed me with good health. I had a significant cancer challenge 10 years ago and didn't know it at the time, and but got over it, and I'm healthy with, I think, a good future in front, you know, as far as meeting that challenge.
Well, Sam Nicholas, thank you for your testimony, your witness
I'm
today
delighted
with
to be
us.
here, and of course, as you know, as I've said, part of my root system is right here at this institution, and so I'll always be grateful for this reception I've got at the college and the favors it's done for me. You know.
Well, thank you for showing us the grace to be here today and sharing so candidly.
Very good. I enjoyed it.
All right, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.